you are just at the heart of the Holodomor here, especially during the famine, when you are reduced to the basic instance of just to survival, really, when you choose between whether it's your children or your neighbor's children who are going to starve to death. And indeed, that perpetrator that I mentioned, when I was recording him, he was telling me in Bolshevik terms about how they believed it. But also he mentioned that his mother's legs were already swollen because they were starving. So she was swollen with hunger. And between the lines, I could read that not complying, questioning or refusing to follow the orders of his uncle, who was a headmaster of the school, so one of the perpetrators on the ground who organized the logistics. He spoke about general context within which there is very little room for compassion.
Genocide is a new word combining the Greek word genos meaning race or group, with the root of the Latin sidere meaning to kill.
Became interested in genocide because it happened so many times.
Power is all against one. Violence is the opposite. The extreme is one against all.
This is Not to Forgive, but to Understand, a podcast series discussing genocide studies with experts and those connected to its critical questions. I am Luis Gonzalez Aponte, co-host with Saba Karim.
And what we're about is really to try to understand why evil happens, why there are perpetrations in genocidal scenarios and scenarios of mass atrocity. Not to forgive, but to understand.
Forgive, but to understand.
Not to forgive, but to understand.
Today we're joined by Daria Mattingly, a historian whose work focuses on perpetrator studies and the social and cultural history of the Soviet Union, with particular emphasis on Ukraine. In this conversation, we discuss her research on the Holodomor, examining the role of rank-and-file perpetrators and actors involved in the on-the-ground enforcement of famine policies. Our discussion draws, in part, on her dissertation titled Idle, Drunk, and Good for Nothing, the Rank-and-File Perpetrators of the 1932 to 1933 Famine in Ukraine, and the representation of cultural memory, as well as her forthcoming book, Stalin's Activists.
Daria, your dissertation was on the perpetrators, the rank and file, involved in the 1932-1933 famine in Ukraine, known as the Holodomor. Tell us more about it, and tell us what prompted you to research the area, and eventually also tell us about your findings.
Thank you. That is the very important question indeed, because not many people internationally know what the Holodomor is unless they've heard about Ukrainian history or have friends from Ukraine or follow up the news about Ukraine. And Ukraine's history is rich, and rich for better or for worse. For the most part of the 20th century, Ukraine was part of the USSR. And USSR, as a union of socialist Soviet republics, was a communist country, at least on paper. And one of socialist policies of a communist country was to industrialize and to collectivize, to make agriculture mechanized and to force, or voluntary or not, farmers and peasants into collective farms. And collectivization as a policy proved to be very ineffective in a way of producing economic results. But for political reasons, for political aims, it was a successful policy because it ensured that the Soviet leadership had total control over body, over space, over any activity in the countryside, over the peasantry. And one of the outcomes of collectivization, immediate collectivization, was that people starved in the countryside. And at the time, it was a peasant country, the Soviet Union, in the 1930s, when collectivization was enforced. At the time, most of the population lived in the villages, and they starved because once you're herded into collective farms where nothing belongs to you, and no matter how hard you work, you don't own the means of production. You don't own the results, the products of your labor. People felt that they were not motivated to work to till the land that didn't belong to them, and to look after the cattle, look after the livestock, and the implements they didn't own. So productivity at the collective farms was low, and the state still collected what it considered to be it was due. And so people in the countryside, the producers of food, did not have food. And this famine, all Soviet famine, covered not only Ukraine, but also Kazakhstan, Lower Volga region in Russia proper, and Ukraine and Northern Caucasus. What was very specific to Ukraine, though, in 1932-33, was that in Ukraine, this all-Soviet famine was exacerbated even further by specific policies applied to Ukraine alone, and mortality rate was higher than anywhere else, apart from Kazakhstan, but that's a different story. And the famine there started in 1931-33. It finished, but it was also about sedentarization of nomadic population. But in Ukraine, we have, it was breadbasket of the Soviet Union at the time, we have specific policies such as sealing the borders of the republic, very high, impossible to fulfill quotas that the state imposed on Ukraine to submit of grain to submit to the state, and also concurrent persecution of political, religious, and cultural elite of Ukraine. So de facto, it was just destroying civil society and anything that would make Ukraine potentially different to the rest of the USSR. So that specific period was an all-Soviet famine that followed collectivization, was called Holodomor in Ukraine, because for half a year it was intense policy of starving population of Ukraine together with persecution of its political elite. And as a result, we have around 4 million people dead when there was no war, no armed conflict. We have destruction of material culture of Ukraine, of cultural heritage, as well as any suggestion that there could be independent Ukraine in the foreseeable future. Obviously, Ukraine became independent in 1991, but this Holodomor is death by hunger, if you translate it from Ukrainian, refers to a specific half a year, winter 1932-33, when people were starved and there were policies preventing them from leaving the republic, from leaving their villages, which was not applied anywhere else in the Soviet Union, or was applied later. But it was punishing Ukraine for the events of 10 years prior, following October Revolution in Russia, when Ukraine did not support the Bolsheviks and did not want to be part of the new Soviet state. And it took couple of years to subdue Ukraine. And then you had 10 years of relative peace with Ukraine. And then during collectivization, Ukrainians rebelled against the policy. Nobody wanted the collective arms, not even in Russia proper. And then it was punished. So that's in a nutshell, but sorry for talking for such a long.
No, that's great. So you spoke about the policies earlier. You mentioned the policies that were implemented at the time. Could you tell us more about these laws in more specific detail?
After collectivization, the state, not after, even during collectivization, the state, with a common planned economy, wanted to know how much and what was produced, how much it would export, how much it would invest, and how much it would have resources it would have to pay for industrialization. And many economic historians argued that the Soviet leadership was constricted by ideology, and it was stuck in certain ways on industrialization, and it had no choice because it didn't have overseas colonies, and Stalin writes about that in his articles, that they had to squeeze the peasantry, and sometimes it is referred as internal colonization, and that it had to get that capital somewhere, and the peasantry majority of the population had to give it to the new young state. So the policies were quite not modern in their essence, how they were enforced and how they were conceived. In a way, it just assumed that the state or the Kremlin, the leadership, knows best. It has epistemological authority, and everything else is to follow. But obviously, people were revolting and against these policies, and some perpetrators, and that's why I'm looking at them, did not want to enforce these policies or facilitate them, and they would desert in their positions and leave in. So these policies, for example, after and during collectivization, it was to bring all land into collective ownership, but de facto it was owned by the state. There were two types of collective farms. One was state farms, so owned by the state, but majority were collective farms, and they were supposed to be all the land in the collective farm and all the implements were supposed to be owned by the collective. But de facto, it was still the state who decided what was to be sown, what was to be harvested, and how much of it would be left in the village to be consumed by the very collective farms who produced that grain or corn on a cob or whatever. So in a way, these policies were conceived at the top, and there was no precedent in history how to enforce them and how it would all work. And there were many conspiracy theories around in the countryside that women would be collectivized, or there would be no God, and but there were so many different things. Children would be collectivized, and they would be brought up as Soviet citizens, and so on and so forth. But in practice, it was the village would consist of one or two or maximum 4 collective farms. All fields would be redrawn. There would be in 1930 there were the whole policy of redrawing the fields and where and how all the implements would be collected from collective farms, and usually it was in the premises of the former big industrial scale farmers who were dekulakized or dispossessed and deported and sometimes executed, deported sometimes to Siberia or far north in Russia, but usually and some of them actually stayed within Ukrainian Republic in less productive parts of it. But so their premises, their houses would be the basis of the collective farm. And due to the high number of acts of armed resistance in Ukraine during 1930, in particular, more than percentage-wise than anywhere, proportionally more than anywhere else in the Soviet Union against collectivization. Stalin even wrote his infamous or famous, it depends which perspective you espouse, article about dizziness with success, claiming collectivization was amazing as a policy, and it was it's some not so good excesses, he called them excesses of collectivization. They were just the results of the it was the people on the ground to blame. Sometimes they get dizzy with success. They are so taken aback by the speed of collectivization and the results it's achieving that they sometimes allow themselves excesses, such as closing the churches in 1931, or synagogues or mosques. And then they sometimes allow themselves cruelty, or they want to discredit the Soviet authorities. There are enemies of the people as well. They're already in the rhetoric. But otherwise, collectivization is there to stay, and it's purely voluntary. And as a result, and that was in March 1930, by summer, we have millions of collective farmers leaving collective farms and not wanting to stay there. But it was just a respite for Stalin. Half a year later, the drive to bring people into collective farms started again, and tortures, dekulakization, as I mentioned, dispossession and deportations. In Ukraine alone, we have 1 million kulaks, or industrious and wealthy peasants or farmers, and those who were simply opposed to Soviet policies or critical of them were deported to Siberia and north of Moscow, to the White Sea. And then we have policies that were promptly followed collectivization, such as the law of 5 ears of wheat, or sometimes 3 thicklets. But its official name of this decree is on the protection of socialist property. So when collective farms don't work and people starve, they naturally try to obtain food somewhere else. And you go to the fields, you go to the warehouses, storehouses, and that's where that property was protected. And you could end up in jail for 10 years, or sometimes you would be executed. But majority of those cases, it's about between 2 to 3 years. So if you were caught gleaning or pilfering in the fields, collected something in the fields, some food, some leftovers after the harvest, you could go to labor camp or forced labor to work for free pretty much at the collective farm, or to indeed you would be put in prison. So that's those faminogenic policies that were used, as well as sealing of the borders. So you'd be, if you want to go to Russia and Belarus, and indeed many Ukrainian peasants did go there. We have thousands stopped at the border and sent back, or they went through filtration camps to just ascertain they were not, I don't know, enemies, counter-revolutionaries, or Petlurites, which is the name of Ukrainian national movement 10 years prior, which loomed large in Stalin's correspondence with his envoys to Ukraine, because he always feared there would be some resurrection, some counter-revolution in Ukraine with national undertone, and they would be backed by Poles, and Polish counter-revolution is the worst of all. So yes, all these policies were to keep Ukraine in check, to create conditions under which you would decide who could eat and who could not. Another policy included blacklisting, which means a village or collective farm would be put on a blacklist, and all essentials for cooking would be taken out of the village, such as kerosene or gas, it used to be called salt, matches, anything to help you to prepare food, to cook, would be taken out. Because if you have food, then it means you didn't submit everything you had to the state to fulfill those quotas, which were impossible to fulfill. And then you would be hoarding, and therefore you are not allowed to eat until you fulfill your plan, you meet the target. Yes, so and just to briefly answer your question, I was looking at people who were facilitating these policies, who went with searches from house to house to see what people were hoarding and hiding from the state. I also looked at teachers, well, obviously village officials, collective farm officials, different activists, communists, party cells, and so on and so forth. So to see how they were involved, what they did, what motivated them, how they made sense of their experience later on, and so, yeah.
So basically, in most cases of genocide, we tend to automatically blame the higher echelons. So if you take, for instance, I did my PhD on the Cambodian genocide, and we inevitably blame, for instance, the policies that were implemented in the labor camps on Pol Pot and his clique. But what we often overlook is that the injustices, the cruelty of all of these policies are being implemented by the people who are at the grassroots level. And I think that's exactly what your thesis does. It focuses on the ordinary people who were involved in the perpetration of this cruelty. Tell us more about this.
Absolutely. This is the best question you could ask me, because even though it's been years since I'm finishing my book about them, it's been years since I've been researching them, I cannot stress enough that, like in any other case of genocide or mass violence, the Holodomor is not unique in that it was possible because of the participation of ordinary people on the ground. And in case of the Holodomor, yes, of course, the Kremlin and its policies, and this is the high command. Likewise, the Holocaust wouldn't have been possible without Hitler. But it builds on something that is already there, whether it's anti-Semitism or low value of human life, like it was in the Russian Empire. This habituation of the population to violence, especially with all the civil war and October Revolution, and that followed February Revolution, and all this uncertainty, and habituated people to violence to begin with. And then in Ukraine, after you eliminate civil society and the remnants of the previous state, because Ukraine after October Revolution had a brief time of when it was fighting for its independence, it's had its army, it's had its political elite. When you eliminate that at the same time, it's very easy for the Soviet authorities to position themselves as the only alternative on the ground. There is no other Ukraine, there is only Soviet Ukraine. And people on the ground, we're talking about majority of the perpetrators in the Holodomor were local Ukrainians, either from the cities or from the villages where they were coming from, where they came from and they were working there. It was them who made the Holodomor possible. And it was majority of them were conforming. They were following the orders, just like they always do. And when we're talking about on the village level, we're talking about 30% of the village being involved in one or another capacity in facilitating the famine, whether it's conducting the searches or whether it was taking account of how many chickens such and such have, or how many cows, or how many coats they're having, or embroidered shirts and other valuables that could be exchanged for food later on, or taking sacks with grain to the train station, or guarding them in the warehouse. It's all mechanism of the faminogenic policy in the countryside that involved many people. And of course, it wouldn't have been possible without the orders from Moscow. And we see them very clearly, how they are sent and followed and overseen by Stalin's envoys. And Stalin was acutely aware of what was happening on the ground. He was in touch by telegraph with his envoys Molotov and Kaganovich. Molotov, then obviously we know him, he's famous for Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. But before that, in 1932-33, he worked on the ground. He went to Odessa in Ukraine, he went to Northern Caucasus, and he was sent in telegraphs to Stalin, and it was back and forth, how to make district officials in Ukraine pump more grain, or how to make them, teach them a lesson. So they are talking about political agenda here. It's not about getting grain. And in fact, grain didn't play a crucial role in 1933 in financing the industrialization, simply because during the Great Depression, there was overproduction of wheat in the world, and there was a crisis in 1933. So the prices were falling, and you wouldn't get much for Ukrainian grain in an international market. And it was actually gold in the first half of 1933 that the Soviet Union was selling, and that provided capital for industrialization. And at the time, the Soviet Union did not have any gold mines in the Far East. It was buying gold from the population, and tada, why population was selling jewelry, wedding rings, earrings, I don't know, necklaces or anything valuable, because it was starving, and majority of that population was from Ukraine. And we have figures, it's not my research, it's a research by Yelena Osokina in the US, but she draws on all the archives in Moscow. She's a Russian historian working in the US. She has 2 books now published And she shows the exports in the 1930s and how industrialization was financed. And it was gold in 1933 from the desperate people desperate to survive. So, yeah. And again, we have people on the ground involved in how it was possible, and even to procure that gold from the starving population in the rural Ukraine. So to organize this state-owned, it's not pawn shops, but they were just ironically called trade with foreigners. They were set up to trade with foreigners, foreign engineers and foreign specialists and experts who came to help with industrialization efforts, whether it's a power station or a plant being built. There were American engineers, for example, and they would come with foreign currency, and these shops facilitated the exchange of that currency into Soviet rubles. But in 1932-33, and they were very conveniently set up in rural Ukraine to procure gold and money. Ethnic minorities, Germans and Jews and Poles, would have from their relatives from abroad. So yes, people working in those shops were also part of this mechanism of the Holodomor, and Ukraine in that way was unique from, let's say, Kazakhstan, because it had a large Jewish population. Obviously, it dates back centuries, who had gold, and they were exchanging that gold for food.
So I noticed after reading your thesis that people do not speak about the rank and file, those cadres who were young boys in their teens, who were the ones who were implementing these injustices onto the people. What about their stories is my big question.
As someone who grew up in Ukraine in the 1980s and 90s, when the Holodomor was no longer silenced, and these family stories where you could put it in a broader perspective of what was happening, rather than hearing from your grandparents or your parents what happened to them, you could appreciate the scale of the famine and you could appreciate why it was happening. I was always puzzled that neither in my grandmother's account or my grandfather's account of their experiences during the Holodomor, they never explained why. Who were these people who came and took their provisions away, and what happened to them? Only on one occasion, and which was also confirmed in other novels on the topic, my grandmother mentioned that, oh, they were punished by divine intervention during World War II. Some of them became lost a leg, or they became alcoholics, or some accident happened to them, something happened to them and they died, or they were maimed, or so there was some poetic justice done to them, because obviously the state supported these policies and there was no remorse, and there was no justice otherwise. And it wasn't sufficient answer to me, neither in the novels I read, nor in this anecdotal evidence on the subject. And there was no scholarship either, because just like with the Holocaust and other cases of mass violence, there had to be either a pause between the event and the reflection, or there was obviously silence imposed and censorship by the Soviet authorities. So together with my colleagues from a different now generation, we looked into social history of the famine, and there was Oksana Kis who looked in gender history and how, for example, women's survival strategies differed from an experience from that of men, children, elderly, disabled people, what medics did, and so on. And I looked into perpetrators specifically. And yes, I used generational approach because I intuitively thought it would be younger generation believing the ideals, especially there were memoirs left by different perpetrators. And I was lucky to interview one of them who was 15, 16 at the time, and he was Komsomol, and he spoke Bolshevik, and he tried to convince me when I was recording him that it was because they believed they were changing things, and there was no other way. It wouldn't have been possible even to think about defying the orders or not doing what you were told.
Yeah.
Likewise, Soviet dissident Kopelev talks about himself not having blood on his hands, very conveniently, just like Eichmann said in his account, and that we did believe some of these Ukrainian peasants were Japanese spies. We did believe that the war was imminent and we needed to procure this grain, and he didn't see any people dying. Actually, he did, because I went to that village and I worked in the security services archives, and he was very economical with the truth, but so are all perpetrators, because there is this self-representation motivation. Neither myself, I wouldn't talk about how bad I am. You would only hear good things about myself, obviously. And perpetrators are no different.
Very often, I think we see this trope, this common trope in all genocides, where primary perpetrators, or the ones who are most responsible, usually they always bring up this defense, rather, or this excuse that they were doing whatever they did for the greater good of humanity, and they had altruistic, humanistic motives. And normally what happens typically is mid-level and lower-level perpetrators, as you mentioned earlier, say, we were just following orders. So these are the typical defenses or excuses that these different categories of perpetrators bring up, either in a court setting or, of course, even any informal, non-legal setting whenever they need to explain whatever they did. Now, in your thesis, and again, I picked on little things here, I hope it's okay, but I noticed that you speak about euphemisms, and I think we must speak about this subject. Again, a common trope in a lot of jurisdictions, or rather in many genocides that have taken place, people tend to, of course, disguise the horror of what they are doing. So they use euphemisms. So in the case of the Holodomor, you mentioned the term food difficulties. Of course, this is probably translated. But could you tell us more about the use of these euphemisms? Because for instance, right now, what I read is that even newspapers are censoring themselves in the US, and they don't use words such as, in the context of Gaza and Israel, they don't use the word occupied territory. They're avoiding these kinds of words which might be inflammatory in terms of the reactions that they will get. So tell us more about these euphemisms that were unique to the Holodomor.
Yes, you already mentioned food difficulties. Many of them were quite military in how they sounded. For example, grain procurement was called grain front. So as if there was a war. And indeed, some perpetrators were interpreting that as a war that wasn't finished in 10 years prior. It was unfinished revolution, because peasantry still owned property, and in a socialist state, or indeed communist state, there should be no private property. Certainly not arable land should remain in private property. So many of them used euphemisms quite naturally, and it was genuine use that they saw as class enemies, peasants as class enemies, or unreliable enemies, or food difficulties, of course. And right now, in the war with Ukraine, Russian leadership is using a special military operation. They don't even call it the war. And of course, people and all politicians would avoid using the words that would not fit their picture, how they picture the world. And whether they do it consciously or subconsciously is a different question, but they construct a reality. They construct a narrative they want to believe. And the narrative in case of the Holodomor was that there was resistance, there were kulaks, and kurkuls in Ukrainian, which was actually a very made up word, especially for Ukraine. It did not exist before Lenin introduced that in Ukrainian, kurkulo. It was just, to describe somebody who's tight-fisted, but there was somebody who's very greedy and after the profit. But otherwise, there was no group or social group as such, as it was divided. The village community was divided later during collectivization into kulaks, middle peasants, and poor peasants. So yes, euphemisms were used, and it's interesting how they were later used by dissidents or somebody who wanted to talk about the famine amid the censorship. And Yes, it's incredible how things changed in the 1980s during Glasnost, when it was possible to discuss the evils of the past and everything surfaced, and as open language was no longer used. But until then, it was incredible how this almost surreal constructed reality just filled the actual reality. And when you live alongside somebody who killed your family and you cannot even call them what they did, the murderers, or you cannot vocalize and articulate your trauma simply because there was no famine, food difficulties, everybody starved, and otherwise there was no Holodomor as such. So, yeah.
My question now is about something that's very close to my heart at the moment, because I am teaching a course on women, crime, and justice. You mentioned in your thesis that the portrayal of women perpetrators was very different and very unique, and you delved into that a little bit. So women as criminals are usually always portrayed in a skewed fashion. They are seen as abnormal. They are seen as going against their nature, and this nature in those days especially, well, thankfully for feminist writing, that's changing that image. But in those days, women criminals were seen to go against their nature as carers and nurturers and protectors. Now, tell us how this played out in the portrayal of women criminals or women perpetrators who were involved in the Holodomor.
Wow, that's a question very cuts close to home. Simply because being a female researcher in Ukraine, which still remains fairly conservative, raising this issue in one of the articles, then which was translated and published in Ukraine, it created quite a heated discussion between historians and just general public, because these stereotypes are still alive about nurturing nature of women, and the area of violence, especially mass violence, is reserved for the men. It's not natural for women to be involved. But as we know, and many studies show, that women are capable of perpetrating mass violence just as men are. And so, yes, indeed, their portrayal is still in Ukrainian novels and in Ukrainian drama and film is described as abnormal. So it's motherhood gone, or something is wrong with the mother in question, or women are described as promiscuous, or they are monsters, and so on and so forth. So this all is present. And when you work in the archives, however, you see incongruity between how they are depicted and how they actually experienced that on the ground, which is congruent. Well, there is incongruity, but it's pretty much congruent, the actual experience, what really happened with society going through modernization. And that modernization is quite turbulent, quite violent, and women are beaten up. They're subject to sexual, gender violence. They're subject to starvation, no less than men. And we see they are depicted as promiscuous, extremely unnaturally cruel, and they meet awful end as a result. They are punished. There is also poetic justice not only for committing violence, but also for not meeting gender expectations and transgressing, so crossing that line, becoming a man, cutting their hair short, wearing leather jackets, short skirts, and being modern woman, trying to become this Soviet emancipated woman. This is not what Ukrainian traditional rural society was expecting of them. And in fact, when I was researching, and they will be in my book, that's not in my dissertation, in more detail, Stahanovite, or shock workers in the countryside, these young female collective farmers who were driving tractors, so defying all these gender norms, who were jumping with a parachute from the planes, who were shooting rifles, who were part of all these Soviet youth organizations and just embracing the opportunities that were offered to them, but as well as perpetrating the Holodomor, because otherwise they wouldn't be activists and celebrated. When I'm looking at their experience, it tells a completely different story. But they, of course, they were trying to make sense of the famine as well in their participation. And some of them actually showed remorse, while others said, well, this is how life is. And those were the best years of my life. And they are motivated. And I could see that very few of them actually were motivated by ideology. Majority of them were just jumping at a chance to have new shoes, to have new clothes, to go and study, to see Moscow, to see Stalin. And we have video footage to show that they actually enjoyed themselves. So for women, it was very, I would say, diverse how they experienced the Holodomor. Starvation and perpetration was very diverse and dependent, if I'm not mistaken, on individual, but also, yes, unfortunately, gender stereotypes persist, and that's why we historians help to slightly chip at those stereotypes.
That's absolutely true. So I have a question now about empathy. Very often genocide scholars speak about the importance of empathy in terms of even just preventing genocide, preventing violence. But I think whenever I imagined or I pictured that whole setting when I read your thesis, your dissertation, because you spoke so much about the rank and file, for me, the rank and file who indulged in these cruel actions against others, for me, there were two categories of them. Or actually, let's not reduce anything to binaries here, but let's just say I sort of thought about what if I was there and I was in that time, in that space, and for instance, I was deprived of food. What I'm trying to get at is that the quality of empathy, the emotion of empathy, the sentiment of empathy can only be afforded in good times, in times of luxury, when everything is comfortable and when we are given what we need. We are not, for instance, facing hunger or the deprivation of basic needs. Now, among all of these perpetrators, among all of these rank and file, what I was thinking about was how many people were pushed to also be cruel and go against their nature and not be able to afford the luxury of empathy. So is this something that you probably confronted or had to deal with or thought about while doing your thesis?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think this is the crux. I mean, you are just at the heart of the Holodomor here, especially during the famine, when you are reduced to the basic instincts of just to survival, really. When you choose between whether it's your children or your neighbor's children who are going to starve to death. And indeed, that perpetrator that I mentioned, who was 15 and 16 in Komsomol at the time, when I was recording him, he was telling me in Bolshevik terms about how they believed it. But also he mentioned that his mother's legs were already swollen because they were starving. So she was swollen with hunger. And between the lines, I could read that not complying, questioning, or refusing to follow the orders of his uncle, who was a headmaster of the school, so one of the perpetrators on the ground, who organized the logistics, all these young, high school students going around and collecting food. He spoke about general context within which there is very little room for compassion. And yet we have these moral dilemmas, quandary that these perpetrators faced. I mentioned this article by Stalin, Dizziness with Success, and there was reaction to that article by the perpetrators themselves, who wrote to Stalin himself, to the Kremlin, to local committees. And in Ukraine, when I worked in the archives in Ukraine, this is where I actually fished them out, the local committees, in these letters they questioned how could we step back when we went that far already, listing and in very vivid detail their experiences on the ground when they had to sentence a family to death by taking their meager possessions and foodstuffs, and saying, and now we've done it for nothing. You, Stalin, letting collective farmers leave the collective farms, and we already did so much. And so actually admitting to committing a crime, and then Stalin going back on his policy and allowing people to leave the collective farms was betrayal for all the sacrifice, moral sacrifice they made as perpetrators of mass violence. And we also have cases when people were deserting their positions or crying, and sometimes children were describing their parents who were perpetrators' experiences, how they would conduct a search, come home and cry because they were doing that to their distant relatives or friends or neighbors. And I believe that is the special feature of the Holodomor, if you like, as a case of mass violence and genocide, as a famine, that it left very little room for maneuver and for this empathy. So for those people who I call them compromised perpetrators, for them it was something they later spoke about, either to their families or to their readers in memoirs, or sometimes they just kept it until they died and never mentioned again because it was too painful.
You resort to plays, novels, memoirs, and poetry, among other things, to note the role of the rank and file in the Holodomor. What were the challenges that you had to face in collecting this material and in the course of analyzing them?
Yes, this is excellent question, because how can we trust a fiction, essentially, right? And I didn't, and that's why I went to the archives. So with Kopylov, living memoirs, he named the villages where he went, and I went to those villages and collected oral memory, and as well as just interviewed people. The same with Stahanovites, these shock workers. I went to their families. I listened to one side of the story, and then I went to the archives and looked what was recorded and what other statements they made. And sometimes, so I was reading their testimonies in tandem with archival documents, and sometimes I could see they were lying, lying completely. And it is, my research was reminding of detective work. My supervisor, Rory Finin, even called me a sleuth, because you collect different pieces of evidence to see what actually possibly and probably happened. And this way I borrow from Christopher Browning when he said that if perpetrator describes something in very great detail, then it most probably was true, whether it was probable and possible. And sometimes they go against self-representation, so their own personal interest. And there was another account which I found very moving and poignant and uncanny, if you like, by Vasily Grossman. And I interviewed his daughter. I went to Moscow for that. That was before the war, well before the war. And she told me that that account of the perpetrator, of a female perpetrator, was based on a real person, and gave me her details. And then later I found out that he did a poetic justice, because the heroine, or this antagonist in his novel, died of cancer, and she repented, and she made a confession that she really, really regretted what she was involved in the Holodomor. But in real life, the prototype was far from that, and she enjoyed the benefits the cooperation with the Secret Service offered her. She participated in the Holodomor. She reported on Soviet dissident writers, and many of them ended up in Gulag. And she received for that two-bedroom apartment not far from the Kremlin. So she really cooperated. And yeah, so yes, that's to answer your question about how you work with novels that are full of poetic justice and memoirs that are full of self-representation in a good way. And the question is, the answer would be try to draw on many, many other independent of each other sources, and then you actually see what was probable, possible, and most likely that happened, and you meet somewhere in the middle. So that would be the answer.
Tell us more about the differences that you felt existed among all of these texts that you explored. When we had a chat informally when you were here in Arizona in Flagstaff, we talked about how these different works could be distinguished on the basis of the people who are writing them. So people within Ukraine had a story to tell. People who were part of the diaspora community had a different story to tell. So there are all of these different, if you want, perspectives on who were the real culprits of the Holodomor. And these are some of the distinctions that you actually noticed, and you wrote an article, a full-blown article on that as well. So tell us more about that.
Yes, that's interesting because we observe specific tropes and how they describe the famine. One trope, and it relates to the agency, who did it in a way. So people staying in the Soviet Union and more or less loyal to the regime, and I'm talking about everybody on the ground to the very top. And I did mention in Flagstaff that even the general secretary of the Communist Party, Brezhnev, decorated man, and which associated with the 1970s, late 1960s, and early 1980s, so the golden part of the Soviet history. He himself was in Ukraine, in central Ukraine, procuring grain from the peasants as part of student trade union at the time in 1932-33. And he, in his memoir, too, describes that as necessary. Yeah, there were some excesses and kulaks were not happy, but otherwise, these people describe it as something they embraced because it was part of the Soviet history and it was part of necessity. And they didn't preoccupy themselves with human rights or whether it was empire, whether it was colonialism. In effect, it was in non-Russian Soviet republics. They didn't ask these questions in their tropes. They embraced it. So I call it embraced agency. And then there were people in diaspora who left the Soviet Union during World War II, for example, or even prior to that, later, dissidents and Ukrainian nationalists in particular. So he interpreted the Holodomor as an assault on Ukraine, one of many in Ukrainian history, which is rich for its conflicts with Russia. And they saw that the Holodomor was possible primarily because of the Russians. So they placed the agency in Moscow. And there was, of course, anti-Semitism in that as well. So it was Judeo-Bolshevism, especially during World War II. So that trope is there as well. But they place it firmly in Moscow. So without Moscow, nothing would have happened. And the Holodomor is an attack on Ukraine, its soul, its body, which peasants were associated with. And ultimately, only independent Ukraine could protect itself from another assault, and which we're now witnessing. In a way, this interpretation does make it's logical. And then there is a third trope, which I think is the most nuanced. And it shows how ordinary people, for banal reasons, sometimes to settle scores or to get somebody's wife or husband or to revenge for the past wrongs, they not embrace, but they do participate in the mass violence. They do kill their neighbors. And there is a myriad of reasons why people commit violence. Yes, ideology plays a role, but ultimately it is a tragedy. And that trope could be found in many novels by dissident writers as well as in some after Ukraine became independent. But it requires a lot of reflection to say that the agency is dispersed. So there are different agents, just like in any cases of genocide and mass violence.
This was Not to Forgive, but to Understand, with our guest, Daria Mattingly. To our listeners, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more discussions.